full screen now.
Wonderful.
This is your preview so you can see your notes.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's been a pleasure to be at the conference so far, and the theme of conciliance and the diversity in the room has been fascinating to me. So I represent one fractal of that diversity, and this is a picture that was compelling to me because when I was in high school, I first met Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at SRI, and they were doing remote viewing experimentation, Stargate, and I haven't stopped asking questions ever since. So we're here today to talk about some of the research that we've been doing, funding in subtle energy. And in particular, we're here to talk about a clear hypothesis, perhaps a complementary conciliant approach, given our respective backgrounds as entrepreneurs and investors. Some of the research efforts we've been doing to date as the Meraki Institute and Emerald Gate, and then also walking you through a little bit of a systems roadmap and mapping approach, whereby we're looking to define a set of research priorities and would love the collaboration of people in this room because I think we're going to collectively make a difference together. Now, we've been talking about a pretty clear hypothesis over the past couple of days. We believe there are fundamental cracks in our Western scientific worldview, right? Perhaps a mechanistic view of the world is insufficient. Perhaps complex systems are not reducible to their parts. Maybe not only material things are real, in other words, things that we can't see, perhaps they also matter, right? And objects aren't entirely separate, but rather are non-locally connected across space and perhaps time, right? And the physical world is not independent of our observation, but influenced by it. So, common themes we've been discussing for the past couple of days. Now, we've decided to focus on a particular aspect of this, which is subtle energy. And I think one of our collaborators, Dr. Bill Tiller, Stanford Emeritus Professor, has characterized, that there is a set of experimental data well beyond the four known forces in the universe, and they're convertible to observable data through a transducer like a living system. Our human body happens to be such a living system. So we've identified many monikers for this: prana, chi, ki, subtle energy. So we won't get caught up in the monikers, and we'll talk more about that a little later. But suffice it to say that there appears to be a self-organizing field of influence, perhaps an energetic field of information that has a certain set of characteristics. We've heard over the course of the conference that it's imprintable to certain objects, that it passively influences, perhaps with no participant effort required, and it affects across distance, non-locally. There are some distinct challenges in researching subtle energy, as we know, as it defies direct measurement today, right, and is detectable only through its effects, in large part through a transducer. We have experimenter effects that we've talked about. We've got entanglement. So not the easiest thing to research, as we know. And in fact, to make matters worse, there are some systemic challenges with subtle energy research. We're well familiar with the lack of funding, right? There is no clear, focused consensus roadmap across all of the multidisciplinary people in the room, right? And from a methodological perspective, we really don't have a consensus-approved, consistent, or necessarily highly, highly rigorous approach to studying something as ethereal as this today, right? Collaboration transdisciplinarily, right? Perhaps it's not what it could be. And from a data perspective, we're seeing in the research relatively few quantitative outcomes, right? Perhaps no common standards across educational for healers and the like, or even subtle energy devices. And then when it comes to language and lexicon, we've heard this at least half a dozen times, right? What we're doing with our language can be confusing internally as well as externally. So there's increasingly a set of entrepreneurs, corporate researchers, business people, funders from other domains that have a sincere interest in helping move this space forward. After having left my corporate environment, I used to run global R&D at a large software company, been a venture capitalist for about a decade, and a multi-time entrepreneur. After that experience with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, I came back many decades later to take a close look at, indeed, what has progressed. And honestly, we had ever more robust a set of evidence around all of these effects, and that we're missing key pieces, in this Western scientific worldview. But not all that much had progressed in many ways. And so, so a number of us are taking a look at this and saying, how can we help? Perhaps with a conciliant approach to lean in and perhaps further accelerate the progress in the space. So when it comes to each of these issues, funding, what is the prototypical entrepreneurial approach, right, that may be beneficial? Typically what we do is milestone-gated funding, enter with a clear hypothesis, and scale as we validate hypotheses and reduce risk. From a focus perspective, we start with a set of pilot projects and move then quickly beyond theoretical to applied and practical applications. We've heard a lot about that over the course of this past half week. And then we typically do a detailed design up front and only then look to build and scale, looking to remove the largest risks first on the cheapest capital. And then from a methodological perspective, iterative testing for validation, looking to systematically remove risk and with a premium on speed of learning, right? How do we progress and almost parse down this tree of unknowns at a relatively quick clip? And a lot of this is truly about pattern recognition and synthesis, which is why this conciliant theme has been so fascinating to me. By way of collaboration, everything we do in the entrepreneurial world is with a multidisciplinary team of specialists. In fact, the outcomes are directly a function of the diversity in the room. And from a data perspective, we're typically in search of hard endpoints, right, to clearly calibrate outcomes. We're looking to understand the broader system and the broader system dynamic. In other words, what are the drivers and key mechanisms in the system? And we focus on the outliers, not unlike everybody in the room. We're looking at the edge science because we believe that is the most interesting aspect to explore. And frankly, it also indicates quite an information asymmetry, right? Which is always interesting to entrepreneurs. And indeed, what entrepreneurs do is we pioneer new markets, oftentimes by shifting a worldview or a perspective, right? This gets to the language and lexicon issue. And sometimes that involves messaging and positioning, reframing for people, in essence, what we're talking about. So what we'll be talking about over the course of this afternoon is really a platform for investment to further research, having asked the question, how can we help, right? And has a clarity focus, exclusively supporting frontier science, has a nonprofit foundation structure established to continue in a self-sustaining way and continue to grow in perpetuity to be able to take on the multi-decade level questions that we're asking ourselves, and entirely independent, with no particular agenda aside from the furthering of knowledge. We'll be taking an iterative research and an invention approach, looking to leverage a wide diversity of people across a multidisciplinary set of arenas. And everything we do will be, at this stage, with partners, partnering with the best individual researchers as well as universities, and we will be absolutely systematic, very rigorous outcomes focused, right, with fundamental and applied research, looking to validate truly this notion that consciousness is foundational and integrative to conventionalist material science. We think people matter. There are, I'm sure, many industrial applications. We will start with looking to make an impact on humans in ways that make a difference in their lives. And any time that we talk about practical applications, it's really important to talk about ethical implications, because some of these topics are so fascinating, I'm an engineer, are so technically fascinating that we could end up at some point, not unlike an Oppenheimer, when he witnessed the explosion of the atomic bomb, right? And then you regret the unintended consequences. So I think it's really important to think at that level as well. And this platform that we're launching, we believe it has the ability to extend even into other areas over time, multiple mechanisms, whether it be the licensing of IP, where we have robustly validated outcomes through the research, perhaps commercial incubation of new industries, perhaps to launch a subtle energy economy, right? Platform-level ecosystem support. So we touched upon the lack of standardization with subtle energy devices. What would it look like to have an underwriter's labs of subtle energy devices to truly separate the wheat from the chaff, right? Venture capital funding is something that we know well, and capital markets as well, to the extent that we need to tap that. We believe, given the languaging that we discussed, public relation and policy lobbying will also be, at some point, an important aspect. So what are the implications for all of us, if we do this right? Is it indeed possible to legitimize, frontier science, some of the things we've been talking about, and actually bring that expediently into the scientific canon? Many of the things we're working on, we know deeply and experientially, but they're not represented at all in our science today. What would the blending of science and spirituality look like? What would it mean to usher in a new paradigm of science and perhaps an attendant set of truly different methodologies that are required to study something as strange as the things that we've been discussing, right? What if we were able to seed a post-materialist worldview, right? One that perhaps is deeply interconnected, right? And brings meaning through this new awareness and direct experiential understanding that so many of us look at. I mean, I look at some of the crises in today's world, and I think that appears to be a crisis of consciousness, among other things. And I think perhaps a shift in human values toward deeper meaning and connectivity may be something that we all aspire toward, and perhaps the work that we're all doing in this room, may help lead in that direction. Now, I started this journey about 4 years ago, after being in the corporate world for many years and coming back and looking at it. Meraki is a Greek word. It's one of those words that exists only in one language, in this case Greek. And meraki means doing something purely for the love of it, right? And so the objective of some of my research that I've been involved in with Dr. Tiller and the like has been, how do we accelerate a human shift in consciousness? How do we usher in the acceptance of such subtle energy effects, right? I rail against the notion that we are, apathetic observers in a mechanistic world, right? But rather, I personally believe we're active co-creators, right, in a purposeful, meaningful universe. And as a result, we've held a high bar when it comes to the research, indeed following the scientific method, which we believe in firmly, but focusing on these anomalies that fall outside of the current paradigm that we believe will help us usher in perhaps that next paradigm. So by way of example, one of these projects we started a number of years ago. Dr. Tiller, he has a particular device. Some of you are familiar with it because I've seen it on prior slides, the intention host device, right? It is a device where city-level meditators imprint an intention on this physical device, and then it can be broadcasted to named individuals at physical addresses. We've done work with about 1,000 people, 3 pilot studies over time. Here I'm talking about a IRB-sanctioned, FDA-exempted, double-blind crossover study, placebo-controlled study with 200 participants over 18 months. And the objective was to broadcast a health and wellness intention to them. Our audience was global. And we had a couple hypotheses. One, that those who were unaware of the study and receiving no intention would not change at all. Secondly, that those that were receiving this intention non-locally would show improvement. Finally, those not receiving the intention would show no improvement, and the gains would be sustained and maintained after the broadcast was stopped. So I was actually just chatting with Dr. Paul Mills of UCSD, who is our secondary investigator, about the results earlier. And it turns out, indeed, this control that was entirely separated and no conscious entanglement is, in essence, flatlined, right? And there was highly statistically significant improvement, p-values of 0.001, 0.004 across the NEF self-compassion inventory and the NIH health and wellness mechanisms. And it turns out that there was a significant moderation effect for years of meditation experience. In other words, those folks started higher on the calibration scale and progressed less than others, which I think is quite interesting. One conundrum is that in this crossover design, it appeared that both those that started in the control group with the first 6 months of the study and those that ended up in the control group, in other words, non-broadcast, for the last 6 months of the study, both of those groups did quite similarly, right? And now we're digging into the data. Why might that be? During this period of time and over the past 4 years, the Emerald Gate Foundation has also been investing, and frankly, in many of the researchers in the room. And in fact, It's funded by a very successful businessman and investor who is with us today in the room, and this is one of his philanthropic efforts. Well, Emerald Gate Foundation invests in a variety of areas as a nonprofit enterprise focused on the improvement of the human condition and expansion of conscious mind through enlightenment at the individual and the community level. The primary mission and focus of the foundation is really to lead state-of-the-art research and, over time, commercialization as necessary of the types of frontier science that we've been talking about in an integrated and relational way across a variety of fields like biology, physics, consciousness, and energy fields. And so the objective really is arising from the need to understand the mechanism by which human conscious intention interacts with various forms of subtle energy and influences biology to promote healing and well-being in biological systems, principally as a start. Now, there are three fundamental goals. First, to rigorously advance and bridge the scientific understanding of our mainstream science with the benefit of demonstrated alternative forms of healing. Secondly, how do we apply this advancement and this understanding to the health and well-being of individuals and others impacting real humans? And then finally, how do we raise the awareness of the basis and true nature as a humanity, really truly based on consciousness, right? And so this platform indeed will involve integrated research, directed research, focused on a particular scientific paradigm, and really investing in and working closely in partnership with best-in-class individuals and universities on a global basis. The good news about it is that it is a reliable, long-term, and growing source of institutional capital, right? Therefore, it's well-positioned to support directed and sustained programs for decades, which is, I think, what we need, and has the ability to do so in perpetuity so that we can ask these multi-decade-long questions, which will take that level of persistence to resolve. Now, you're familiar with our friend Bill. We've heard quite a bit about his project, so I won't belabor this, but in the end, it's focused on his Bengtson healing technique. How does it affect tumor growth in mice? What is the way that we can understand the mechanism of this technique? And finally, can we reverse engineer it to make it scalable in application? And as you can see, Dean Radin, Sarah Bassim, Mike Turner, John McMichael have also been participating with a set of healers and a set of experiments. One of the findings is that there is resonant bonding among the mice, right, as a function of shared experience. Secondly, the consciousness, in particular of the experimenter, can decide who is in, quote unquote, in and out of the study, and that hands-on healing, distant healing, and a recording, quote unquote, recording of the healing, all of these things have biologic outcomes, right? And so, what was been measured in the mice were really hematologic values and spleen weight, in vitro studies of cancerous tumor growth. And indeed, some publications like Dose Response have indicated biologic changes as a result of the hands-on healing and recording. Secondly, the healing intention, as I mentioned, can be recorded and broadcast, some similar parallels to the Tiller work. And it turns out that the recording appears to have a loss of fidelity in that it's less efficacious for whatever reason. And there's also been some anomalous healing as well, which has implications for our placebo research and how we think about type 2 errors. And in fact, there's a very interesting conference coming up that our friend Bruce Fetzer is putting on, the Metascience Conference at Stanford in September, where we will be looking through a scientific lens at our science, right? There are decline effects. There are a whole set of effects that are occurring across industry, whether pharmaceutical or otherwise, that simply need to be looked at by way of methodology as we study these things. So in terms of what's next, the analysis of the healing recording, and we're seeing anomalies at very low frequencies, and perhaps there are clinical applications, perhaps over time targeted toward cancer or Alzheimer's. I'm going to touch upon a couple other studies as well. We have started a program with Garrett Yount, Helene, Dean, Delorme, and Lauren Carpenter to really explore objective ways to measure shifts during subtle energy healing and others. Also, what is the mechanism of action in the human body as a function of working with 12 exceptional healers, 240 studies, 240 subjects with neuropathy, in essence, pain, supersensitivity or numbness, and doing this over the course of 6 months, looking directly at pain and inflammation and how that decreases, and in particular looking at both subjective and objective outcomes across stress, well-being, physiology, through questionnaires, biomarkers, environmental measures. We've got both healers and Healies instrumented, as well as the environment instrumented. And we're also using mineral water as a proxy for an objective measurement baseline across these healings. And we're collecting both before, during, and after the sessions. Finally, I'd like to tell you about something that we're doing, which is quite a concilium approach, frankly, and we'd love your collaboration in. We've enlisted a number of people that used to be at the Samweli Institute, the organization CHI, with David Musum, Shamini Jain, and Meredith Sprengel, really to figure out how can we further the science and practice of this subtle energy biofield research by looking across the landscape of constituents and figuring out what are the pressure points in this ecosystem, what are the optimal synergies across stakeholders, and how do we create not only a research database, but also perhaps a systems change roadmap for public use, in other words, the use of everybody in this room. How do we foster increased collaboration? So we're starting with a stock-taking effort, screening a set of tens of thousands of publications to get a research baseline. What do we know? What do we not know? What's a credible hypothesis? What's yet been invalidated? So quite systematic. And then we're also interviewing researchers, healers, funders, device experts, policy experts, and we'd love for some of the researchers in the room to participate. So we're about a third of the way through the 6-month effort, talked to many researchers that are currently researching subtle energy. We've identified 300 biofield devices and we've screened and categorized them. A set of biofield healers, a set of funders we've identified, and then other policy, education, and community members that are strategically relevant. So I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of some of the takeaways to date. So we've looked, the great news is there's abundance of pertinent research over the past many decades. Turns out, perhaps to nobody's surprise, people are not publishing under biofield or subtle energy. So we are literally looking across 24 different domains, if you will. Very few clinical trials in this area have been published recently, and the clinical trials that have been done are inadequately powered. Also, too few longitudinal studies, and too few that incorporate the perspective of healers. When we chat with the researchers, fascinating things come out. Many researchers are involved in this work because of personal experiences, right? And they will be the first to say, there's still a taboo. So mainstream researchers are active in the work, but they're not interested in publishing or openly discussing. Tenured professors want to assist, but they won't be included sometimes on publications. And they emphasize the language indeed needs to be shifted to bridge across biofields, healing, and the language of academic science. And of course, funding is a barrier. Devices, plenty, mostly a cottage industry. Unfortunately, evidence to claims ratio is low. And as a result, a lot of these guys get in trouble with the FTC and the FDA. And there are different theories around how these work. Quantum, are we fostering coherence? Are we reharmonizing the body, protecting from EMF? Electrosmog, again, we're getting all the anecdotal and subjective comments because we think it's really important context. Preliminary takeaways from healers are that people see healing differently. Some see it as a multi-layered field, some see it as a unified field. Others feel it, others see it. Others do hands-on, and frankly, most believe distance doesn't matter. And they'll tell us that quite clearly. They see healing as returning to a normal state as opposed to curing anything. And they encourage acute conditions, a focus on acute conditions like trauma and pain going forward, and perhaps on some somatic disorders that have immune or hormonal components. They're sort of mystery illnesses in the Western domain. So in summary, there are a couple system level needs that have been identified to date. One, how do we develop a common language? In other words, internally and externally, so that we can collaborate with others. Two, how do we nurture and sustain community? I was thrilled to see young researchers here. How do we nurture them? How do we together develop new methodologies to study and get multiple perspectives on healing? And then continue to conduct rigorous research, rigorous clinical trials to share best evidence. And then finally, there may be ways to map the biofield. Cross-validation studies with devices or technologies, perhaps looking at integrative medicine modalities. And so, in conclusion, there are 3 areas of focus of Emerald Gate right now. As you can probably tell, we are very interested in what is the mechanism of subtle energy. Secondly, how might we measure it? Fully being willing to accept that we may never be able to measure it in our three-dimensional world, and that may be okay as well, but we think it's worth giving a shot. And then finally, to the extent we get there, what may be a set of practical applications that we can get in the hands of humans that can make a difference in their lives? And so we love your collaboration, and in fact, badly need it. To the extent that you're doing something that you believe can be relevant and assistive to this agenda, please feel free to reach out, jason@emeraldgatefoundation.org. Secondarily, vis-a-vis the system mapping project, which over time will be made public to everybody, there's a subtle energy researcher survey to the extent you're involved in the research. It's tinyurl.com, Y3X383H7. And to the extent that some of these other aspects of the systems mapping project seem interesting, you can go ahead and email Meredith at chi.is. And I understand that we're running out of time. I will be around for the break and very much looking forward to collaborating with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was a